What is up, folks? Welcome to another episode of The Breakout. I'm your host, Abhi, and this is my co-host, Leo Xia. It's draft season, baby, and we are super excited for the 2021 NFL Draft. As you can see here with, the top two SuperFlex picks from last year, Joe Burrow and Tua. We're ready, man. We have been looking forward. If you play Dynasty, I'm pretty sure that you're looking forward to the draft all year round. I think the championship is like something that, we all play for, but we really live for the draft. So in today's episode, we're going to be doing something that has been a highly requested feature. We're going to be doing a rookie mock draft. We're going to be taking a look at the top 12 rookies across my and Leo's big board. And we're going to be telling you who you should be drafting at what spot and who to avoid and who to grab. Leo, why don't you walk us through what our requirements are and what are our stipulations around this draft?
Yeah, I just want to make it clear, before we begin, basically everyone in this industry, they make their own rankings, they make their own mock drafts, blah, 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 and they release them to Twitter, Reddit, YouTube, and that's how you gain, credibility, right? You make your rankings, and then 3 years later, people check you out. They're like, oh, okay, did you actually have, was N'Keal Harry your wide receiver one? Or were you high on Josh Jacobs when he was going to the draft? So while I think this is the industry standard process for people to go through, I think this is kind of the wrong way to look at it. I think our goal here is to provide a transparent process and use this rankings and mock draft as an exercise for how are we viewing these prospects and how are we ranking them in order. So I kind of want to shift that mindset away from the whole, trust me, I watched the film, therefore you should listen to me, philosophy, more towards here is my process. Here are the tools that you can go and take to build your own process. You may not agree with mine, but you know how I'm ranking these players based on it. So for this mock draft, what we're going to be looking at is SuperFlex 12-team rookie mocks. I feel like this is pretty standard in the industry nowadays. We're going to take a look at their player profiles and the different hit rates. And we're going to try to ignore the individual team needs that you might have in your individual leagues and try to ignore the potential landing spots that players are projected to. We need to do a post-draft ranking also, but for now, we're just trying to look at the players very unbiasedly.
Yeah, and I want to reiterate the point that we as content creators and football fans and analysts want you, our supporters, our, the people who watch our content, to hold us to a standard. We don't believe that you can you have to wait 3 years in order to evaluate the quality of our analysis. We want you at the end of this year to be able to say, hey, Abhi and Leo made great picks. They hit on these things, or they really flopped, and here's why. Our goal is to provide you, as Leo mentioned, tools to perform your analysis, and we don't want to black box it. If we're going to watch film, we want to explain to you what we see so that you can do the same thing if you so choose. But ultimately, we want to be transparent because that's how we build trust with you. So with that being said, why don't we start the clock? Leo, you are picking first at 101. Who do you got?
I'm at 101. I don't have to wait the entire time to make this selection. I'm going Trevor Lawrence at 101. He has the highest floor out of any of the other top quarterbacks. He might not have the highest ceiling, but, he's got the fantastic physicals. He's 6'6", 220 pounds. He's got the vision, the arm strength, the leadership, athleticism, basically all the stuff that ESPN gushes about. And if you're building a quarterback in a lab, you'd end up building someone like Trevor Lawrence. One of the other things that makes him so special is that he's been winning consistently since he was a freshman. PFF graded him at 90.6 as a freshman, and as we've watched him over the past 3 years, it just feels like he's improved every single year. I mean, we probably shouldn't expect him to put up Justin Herbert numbers. Justin Herbert had a historical rookie season this year. But if you're drafting him at 101 and you end up with a top 10 to 15 quarterback in year one, I think you'd be really happy with that pick. The one knock to Trevor, though, and this is kind of league dependent, is in 2019, his touchdown to interception percentage was around 22%. And in 2020, he finished around 20%. So it's not outrageous, but guys like Joe Burrow and Justin Fields in 2019 were around like 10% and 7%, to give you an idea of. So if you're playing in a league with -4 for interceptions, that's something that you're just going to have to accept. Like, he's going to have the highest floor. He'll probably end up posting a top 10 to 15 season, but you'll probably have those frustrating weeks where he's losing large amounts of points because of the interceptions.
Yeah, I mean, we'll also link an analysis that we've done before on Trevor Lawrence up in the banner up here, where, guys like Trevor Lawrence, if you compare him to, Andrew Luck and Peyton Manning, those guys had an absurd number of turnovers their first couple years in the league until they stabilized. If you're trying to win a championship right now, you probably don't want to be going for Trevor Lawrence, but I figure if you're drafting at 101, unless you traded for that pick, your team is probably not in a state to win right now. And so with the 101, your goal is to establish the safest and most valuable pick. And Trevor Lawrence is exactly that.
For sure. Now, Abhi, you're on the clock, 102. Who are you going?
Yeah, so for everyone who knows me, I'm a huge Buckeyes fan. I lived in Cincinnati for 8 years. I love my Buckeyes. And Justin Fields is a guy that I have always been rooting for when he transferred to Ohio State. He's one of those guys that I was super amped. I didn't anticipate reaching the playoff 2 years in a row. Likely should have beaten Clemson both times. But really, if we take my fandom out of it, Justin Fields has been viewed in the same tier as Trevor Lawrence for the last 2 years, many times being referenced as the 1B. If there wasn't a quote-unquote generational prospect like Trevor Lawrence, Justin Fields would easily have been the number one quarterback, if not the number one prospect in this draft. And this idea that Justin Fields isn't QB1 really changed when he played against Indiana and Northwestern, just 2 games, where he threw, I think it was 414 yards, 2 touchdowns, and 5 picks. Not great numbers. But at that point, we have to consider the context around Ohio State. Ohio State was one of the only teams that had an extremely inconsistent schedule, right? First, they weren't going to play the season, then they were going to play the season, then they had COVID outbreaks, and they had this, and they had that. And as a result, they did not have any consistency with their schedule. I mean, they ultimately ended up playing 6 games, but there were very few weeks where they had games back-to-back. And that really impacts you as a team, and especially as a quarterback, where rhythm is super important. Now, it's important to also note that we have a recency bias when it comes to Justin Fields because of that Northwestern game. In fact, it was during that game that this narrative started to spring up that Justin Fields has trouble progressing past his first read. This is something that, if scouts are mentioning it and you're hearing it as a narrative, it's something to look a little bit deeper into. But we're going to link a video up here by a scout named Mark Schoenfield. And he actually goes a lot deeper into this from a film aspect to understand how does Justin Fields progress through his reads. And you'll actually find that in 2019, when many people thought that Justin Fields was the 1B quarterback in this draft, he actually had a much harder time progressing past his first read. In 2020, he cleaned a lot of that up. In fact, he was pulling the trigger a little bit faster, which was resulting in far fewer interceptions and turnover-worthy plays. We do know that Justin Fields can hold on to the ball for a tick too long, but this reared its head a little bit more significantly at Ohio State because the offensive line wasn't as strong as other schools. Specifically, Football Outsiders ranked Ohio State's offensive line as the number 103 best offensive line by sack rate, which ultimately means that yes, Justin Fields was taking sacks, but it can't account for being the 103rd worst or 103rd best offensive line out there. That means that offensive line, if Justin Fields was not perfect, was likely going to give up a sack. And as a result, you saw Justin Fields leaning towards his first read. But ultimately, I think that this issue has been overblown. And again, if you look at that video by Mark Schoenfield, I think that your qualms for Justin Fields will be halted. Justin Fields ultimately has Konami code potential. He can throw it, he can rush it, and in fantasy, that is ultimately what you're looking for. He has a lower floor than Trevor Lawrence, but he has a much higher ceiling, in my opinion, because of that dual threat ability. In fact, he averaged 6 yards per rush in 2019, and that grew to 8.2 yards per rush in 2020. The final thing that I'd like to mention about Justin Fields is that he really pushes the ball downfield, and this is evidenced by the fact that 69.9% of his passing yards came from in the air, which means that Justin Fields isn't accruing yards after the catch in order to inflate his stats. In fact, most of his yards are coming because he pushes the ball downfield. His average depth of target is 10.4 yards, and his best PFF grades come from his deep passing. I think his average grade was 96.5. All in all, I think Justin Fields is an exceptional value at 102.
Yeah, Justin Fields is a great prospect. Couldn't really fault you for going Justin Fields at 2 versus 3. Like, to me, Justin Fields and Zach Wilson are both great prospects, and think it's a great pick.
It's interesting you mentioned that, Leo. What are you picking at 103?
Well, now that you ask, my QB2 is actually Zach Wilson.
Whoa.
I know this is probably... I mean, it's not controversial nowadays, now that Chris Sims is putting Zach Wilson at 1, right? Chris Sims is like, hey, let me be the most controversial guy out here. But when you're drafting at 3, with 3 fantastic quarterbacks on the board, I don't think you have the opportunity to make a huge decision here. You're taking what the draft is giving you. Mm-hmm. So you're not guaranteed a floor anymore, because the guy who has the safest floor is Trevor Lawrence, and he's off the board at 101. The guy at 2 is probably selecting someone who has the highest potential, right? The guy at 2 is trying to match the value of the guy at 1, and so in order to do that, he has to take the guy with the highest potential. So you could argue that Fields has higher potential. I wouldn't disagree. One thing that you mentioned in your Fields analysis that concerned me was his whole pressure to sack percentage. So Justin Fields averaged out at around a 25% pressure to sack percent. Basically, 1 out of every 4 pressures, he was taking a sack. Versus Zach Wilson was at 13.9%. Trevor Lawrence was at 15.7%, excuse me. Mac Jones was at 12.3%. So why is something like that significant? Well, in the NFL, pressure is a lot more significant, and situation that you end up in matters a lot more. So more sacks translates to more drives killed, which translates to more chances that your quarterback isn't putting up touchdowns because they're not on the field. So obviously this is super situational dependent. Once we find out landing spots, these two will kind of like flip-flop back and forth. And don't get me wrong, I still love Fields as a prospect, but in terms of fantasy points, I think maybe you maximize your number of potential points with Wilson. So you're just taking whoever the board is giving you right now.
Yeah, man, Leo, I think that these 3 prospects, at least in a SuperFlex league, are clear-cut top 3. The place where I hesitate about, I guess the hesitations for Justin Fields, and I hesitate about the pros for Zach Wilson, is if you look a little bit deeper at the O-line statistics. So I mentioned that Justin Fields has the 103rd best offensive line ranked by Football Outsiders by sack percentage. By contrast, BYU had the 9th best offensive line by sack rate. And I think this is really important to understand because, I don't think this detracts from Zach Wilson, but I think that this needs to be put into context for what Justin Fields can do. If you ask a lot of film guys, Ohio State's offensive line had so much trouble defending stunts. They really couldn't maintain their blocks for long periods of time, and you could see this by the very low rate of screen yards that Ohio State had. Zach Wilson, on the other hand, having the 9th best offensive line, he has more ability. He has a lot more room to explore, be creative, and make good decisions down the field. And I think that when you consider these two things, I think that the ceiling for Justin Fields is a lot higher. But if you were to pick him at 102, if you were to pick Zach Wilson at 102, we couldn't fault you there either. I think this is really a question of what is your flavor and what are you feeling, safer picking.
For sure. Right. Now that we're at the 4th pick in the draft, this is where it starts to get a little interesting. Who's the guy that you're rolling with at 104.
Yeah, man. So many people would say that with the top 3 picks being quarterbacks, you get all the other position value getting pushed down the board. And that's true, but in this class, that's super unique because that means another QB1 is falling to me at 104, and that's Trey Lance. I personally believe that Trey Lance is the highest risk quarterback in this draft class, at least amongst the top prospects. But if you take a look at his college career, it also shows that he has the highest level of upside. He's only played 16 games in college, his freshman and sophomore year, which is the same number of games that Mac Jones played. And when he was in college, he produced pretty ridiculously on the ground and through the air. He threw for over 3,000 yards, had 30 touchdowns, and only threw 1 pick. He also rushed for over 1,300 yards and 16 touchdowns. Net, what does that tell me? This guy has a much higher potential than even Justin Fields, because he's going to have a lower floor, because he still needs to be developed, but he has a higher ceiling if he realizes that potential. In fact, it's more than possible that when we look back at Trey Lance, we view him as the best quarterback from this draft class. But the thing is that when you're drafting this high in your rookie drafts, you have to consider what the volatility means. And as we talked about with Trevor Lawrence, he is the safest pick. He might not have the highest ceiling, but his range of outcomes is in a pretty safe zone. As you get lower down the board, you get riskier players. You get less safe assets. And Trey Lance is exactly that. But if we take a look at his statistics from college, we know that there's a lot of potential here. He threw a 94.1% adjusted completion rate. His arm reached up to 62-yard passes, in game, and his average depth of target was higher than Trevor Lawrence and Justin Fields at 11.5 yards. He also has, this elite rushing ability where he averaged 10.7 yards per scramble and 6.5 yards per rush overall, combined with the fact that his burst, speed, and acceleration makes him absolutely lethal if he gets any sort of step or edge on a defender. The thing is that his accurate ball rate is 47.2% on deep passes, and if he has the ability to polish his game just a little bit, I think that this guy is going to be fantastic. He is in the top 2 quarterbacks for me when it comes to overall potential in this draft.
I think that's a great pick. Trey Lance is such an exciting player, and I really hope he ends up in a really nice situation because he could be the best quarterback in this draft class.
So Leo, where are you going with 105? We've picked 4 quarterbacks now.
So Abhi, I'm really glad that you went Trey Lance, actually. I love Trey Lance, but you know who I love even more than Trey Lance is Mac Jones. And McDonald's Jones. He looks like he's been eating McDonald's, dude. He does not look like an NFL quarterback, but you know what? He makes the throws. And so I know the question we're going to get after this is, are we reaching for a quarterback? Because the discussion has always been, okay, we've had Trevor Lawrence, Justin Fields, Zach Wilson, and then maybe we start considering Najee Harris, right? Maybe we start considering Jamar Chase before Trey Lance and Mac Jones. But I think we can learn our lesson by looking back into history a little bit. The only other year in the past 20 years where we've had 5 first-round quarterbacks was 2018. So what lessons can we learn from 2018? This was, if you recall, it was Baker Mayfield, Sam Darnold, Josh Allen, Josh Rosen, and Lamar Jackson.
5 goats.
5 goats. I would say there are only 3 goats. There's Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, and Baker Mayfield, right? These are the serviceable guys. The other guys, Sam Darnold and Josh Rosen, you probably don't want on your team. We're looking at roughly 60% hit rate, which is pretty high. It's a small sample size, but let's roll with it for the sake of the exercise. If you're picking at 105, I think the positional value of that pick is greater if you go quarterback than you go any other position. This is obviously especially only true for SuperFlex leagues. And I think in any other draft circumstance, we probably shouldn't reach for quarterbacks here, right? Like if you had 3 quarterbacks drafted, the year where Kyler Murray, Dwayne Haskins, and Daniel Jones got drafted, you could look back now and say Kyler Murray is a clear number 1. Like there's not even discussion. Any other draft circumstance, maybe you shouldn't consider it. But this is an outlier year with 5 quarterbacks. If you're drafting at 5, the positional value of a quarterback is so high that you might have to go QB here. And so I do kind of want to dive into Mac Jones a little bit because I think this is more talking about the draft strategy. And I don't want to look at kind of the overall stats for Jones because I know the argument is like, oh, his production is inflated from his teammates, blah, blah, blah. Like Javonte Smith was always open. Like obviously he's getting touchdowns and stuff. An interesting one I'd like to focus on, I think that's what people are knocking him for, is he's an insanely accurate passer. He threw 15.2% of his passes into tight windows this year. For comparison, Fields threw 8.3%. And I know we keep coming back to Justin Fields, but Mac Jones is actually a very good passer. And he only threw an uncatchable ball on 18.7% of those throws. This is over 10 yards too. So he's putting the ball on the money. And, people knock him because he's not mobile, blah, blah, blah. He's often compared to Kirk Cousins as his potential. And I think people usually view that as a bad thing because guys like Lamar Jackson, Josh Allen, they're running around. They're exciting to watch. But if I'm getting Kirk Cousins, who finished in at QB 11 this year, by the way, if I'm getting Kirk Cousins at 105, I'd be extremely happy with what I'm getting because that's like a perennial QB2, QB1 that is a benchmark to your team. So if he's a system quarterback, game manager, blah, 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 so be it. But hey, man, system quarterbacks put up fantasy points. And in SuperFlex, where quarterbacks are so important, I've really just got to go Mac Jones here.
Yeah, I mean, look, I think that there is an argument to draft Mac Jones at 105 just based on draft capital. We presume he's going to go in the first round. And, the quarterback position is extremely valuable in SuperFlex. But here's kind of, a couple of things that I want to talk about. So let's go in reverse order. So we talk about Mac Jones and his projection to the NFL. We use Kirk Cousins. I want to be very clear about this. Kirk Cousins is a ceiling. At best, I think Mac Jones can be Kirk Cousins. And that means that Kirk Cousins at QB 11, I think he produced his best career year last year at QB 11. No, I'm not giving up the potential to draft Jamar Chase, Kyle Pitts, Najee Harris for Kirk Cousins, And we've talked about the Konami code before, right? All of the 4 quarterbacks that we've mentioned before have some rushing upside. But when it comes to Mac Jones, hell no. Mac Jones is the kind of guy who is a perennial pocket passer, and it's important to note that just because a guy has the potential to stabilize an NFL team, a la Trevor Lawrence, doesn't make them the best player for you in fantasy. Specifically, Mac Jones is a guy who, as you pointed out, his only value add is passing, if he can do that in the NFL. And that upside is not something that I'm willing to pay for at the 105 pick. So that in itself knocks him out of this slot for me. But if we also consider the fact that, his passing ability is something that people really, really like, I would like to point out to you that when we have looked at quarterbacks in the past who have had potentially 3 first-round receivers on their team, the 3 that come to mind are Mac Jones, Tua, turned the ball over, and Troy Smith from 2006 at Ohio State. In reverse order, Troy Smith had Anthony Gonzalez, Santonio Holmes, and Ted Ginn Jr. Troy Smith, although he might have had potential coming into the NFL, was severely aided by his supporting cast. When you look at Tua, he had all 4 of these Alabama receivers that are eventually going to bust in the NFL, maybe sans Jalen Waddle. And again, what are we seeing from Tua in the league? I don't think that Tua is a guy who by himself can carry a team, right? I don't think that he's going to be able to put up the numbers unless he has a supporting cast. And when it comes to guys who on their talent alone can't produce, I'm not willing to take them in the top 5. So when we come to Mac Jones, we have more or less the same thing. Najee Harris, Jalen Waddle, and Devonta Smith. All 3 of them are probably going to go in the first round. And it's more or less the same argument. Mac Jones couldn't beat out Tua for several years. He only started playing because Tua got hurt. And although he put up numbers, again, to all those people who love Devonta Smith, all these guys are older than their competition. And that is why they dominated. Nobody's saying that Alabama isn't a good team, but we are saying that they have an advantage from, being over 2 to 3 years older than most of their competition. And so given that, I don't think that Mac Jones is someone who you should bail on. I definitely can see him having a value in the first round. But guys, I don't think that he's worth it at 105. But hey, come back to me in a year, and if I'm wrong, I'll be glad, because that means that there's more quarterback talent in the league.
So, Abhi, I presume that you're really happy I took Mac Jones at 105 because now you've got your guy at 106. Who are you going 106?
Ooh, my guy. So for those people who have been following our channel for quite some time, you know that there are 2 wide receivers that are in the wide receiver 1 discussion. One guy we love, one guy we hate's too strong of a word. We do not think he has the analytical profile to be successful. But the guy that does, Ja'Marr Chase, I'm taking him here, 106. In normal years, a dude like Ja'Marr Chase would be going somewhere in the top 5. But because of all of these quarterbacks that are coming into the league, this value is being pushed way farther back into the draft than he should be. And if I'm getting him here at 106, that is insane value. I'm getting a wide receiver 1 here, guys. I'm not getting a guy who has the potential maybe to be a wide receiver 1. No, he dominated. So you've heard this bit before. He dominated his freshman season at LSU at age 19, behind the most productive rookie wide receiver in NFL history in Justin Jefferson. And he did it while he was matched up on NFL caliber cornerbacks, guys like AJ Terrell from Clemson and Trevon Diggs at Alabama. He absolutely was a monster, and I think that he has the makeup to be a monster physical X receiver in the NFL moving forward. It's important to note that Ja'Marr Chase, we need to slow down on the comparisons to Julio, because Julio is Julio. There are no other comparisons. And Calvin Johnson is Calvin Johnson. There is no other Calvin Johnson. They were both fast and big. Ja'Marr Chase is not super fast, but where he really provides his value is his physicality and his ability to track the ball. If we take a look at what Ja'Marr Chase has the potential to do, I think that he has an extremely high floor. And if you take a look at the numbers, he had 24 deep catches in 2019, which is the most ever in a single season by a wide receiver in college football. Again, as a rookie, behind Justin Jefferson. He also broke 22 tackles. So net, what is this telling me about Ja'Marr Chase? Ja'Marr Chase has the profile for the best receiver in this class. You combine this with the fact that he's going to be a top 10 pick, and Chase is in a class all by his own. If you want to look at the numbers, we'll link the video up above where we've talked about Ja'Marr Chase several times on this channel. And I'm super glad to get him here at 106.
I absolutely love Ja'Marr Chase. The one thing that I would like to bring up, because this happens every year, I see it, it probably happens like once every 2 years, but players end up gaining so much hype that when you draft him, you have this expectation that there's no way that he could possibly fail. And that's not true. No matter the player, no matter how good his profile is, no matter where you draft him at, there's always potential for players to fail. Last year, the guy was Jalen Reagor. The year before that, it was N'Keal Harry. These guys all had incredible profiles, and they still went on to, not be Justin Jefferson, essentially. And Justin Jefferson had a pretty good profile, too. So I'm not saying that's anything to do with the profile itself. I'm saying that even with all of this data, I think the hype train could grow out of control. Don't set your expectations insanely high because you may find yourself disappointed.
There is always bust potential for someone who hasn't proved it. It's the whole Schrodinger's box, Schrodinger's cat, Schrodinger's Jamar Chase. You don't know what he is until he's in the league. And all that being said, I think that if either of the fan bases that we're wearing right now, Cincinnati with Joe Burrow or Miami with Tua, if they got Jamar Chase, they would be ecstatic. And, ultimately, I'm super excited to see him in the league. Remember to draft the guys that you really like and you want to root for in the league. So, Leo, we've now drafted 5 quarterbacks, and we've finally gotten our first positional skill position off the board. Where are you going at 107?
I'm really glad that you went Jamar Chase at 106, actually, because I was kind of surprised that you didn't go running back. I think a running back is so important to your dynasty fantasy football team because that's what sets you apart from all the other teams in the league. The teams that don't have running backs will be struggling for the next couple of years. If you look at the value over a replacement player for running backs of like fantasy point wise, it drops off around 7 or so. So you have Christian McCaffrey, like Alvin Kamara, those are the top guys. After that, after 7, you might as well like look at the back end of the running back ones. The guy I'm going here is Javonte Williams because I think he has the potential to crack that top 7. He's 5'10", 220 pounds, and he'll be 21 years old by the start of the season, so you'll have him for a long time. He had an insanely productive 2020 season, and one of the crazy things about 2020, he broke the PFF record for broken tackles per attempt with 76 broken tackles on only 157 attempts, and he ranked second in the FBS for runs over 10 plus yards with 42. This means that he was breaking a tackle every other run and then rushing for 10 plus yards on 1 out of every 4 runs, which is insane. And as we know, with Graham Barfield's incredible yards created stat, we love running backs that can go out there and create their own yards for themselves. He's not bad as a receiver. So on 58 targets, Javonte caught 84.5% of them and only dropped 4 catchable throws for career yards per reception of 10.4. That's fine. He's got the hands for it. The one downside is that even though Javonte does have great hands as a receiver, he wasn't utilized that much in the receiving game in college. His 2020 target share was significantly higher than in 2018 and 2019. But even in 2020, it was only 8.4%. And traditionally, running backs that don't see receiving work in college don't see an increase in receiving work in the NFL. So if you had Najee here instead of Javonte, just purely based on receiving, I wouldn't blame you. But I went Javonte because he is roughly 3 years younger, he gets the yards himself, and he has the hands for it.
This is really interesting. I love Javonte, and so I cannot knock you for making the pick here. My question for you, Leo, is do you have Javonte higher than Najee as a talent, or do you have him higher because of his upside?
I think Javonte and Najee are relatively the same for me, talent-wise. I think Javonte has the higher upside just because he's younger.
Okay, I see what you're saying. So here's where I hesitate just a little bit. When we had Drew on the show last time, we talked about drafting for value. So your big board can differ from the communities. That's totally fine. For all I care, you can have Mac Jones as your QB1, right? You can have Javonte as your running back 1. But if I'm drafting those guys at 106, 105, 104, that means that based on the community ADP, I'm probably overdrafting. That means that I probably could still get Javonte at 107 or 108 when I'm overdrafting him now. It's likely that if we were to say, hey, there's Najee and hey, there's Javonte, somebody's going to give you Javonte and something for Najee Harris. And I think that this is a scenario where you're going to have to be vigilant in your independent leagues to make sure that the value that you're getting at your pick is one that has reasonable reason amongst the community. You should make sure that whoever you're drafting at your allotted spot is not a reach, because if you overdraft somebody, you are automatically losing value in terms of extra assets or value that you could have gotten down the line. And for that reason, I don't think that the community is that high on Javonte as they are Najee. And I think that this is an opportunity here where if you wanted to draft Javonte, trade down. But considering that this is our mock draft, you went and got your guy, and I can't knock you for that.
Yeah, I have a completely like opposing philosophy that I'd like to bring up too, because I think that when we look at the community's average draft picks, oftentimes the community is wrong. So last year we had Clyde, right? Before the draft, it was DeAndre Swift who was the 101. And then after the NFL draft, Clyde Edwards-Helaire obviously got taken by the Kansas City Chiefs, and he instantly shot up to 101, even without the analytics profile to back it up. Everyone was hyping him out of control. His value was the 101. So in one of my leagues, we had a guy draft DeAndre Swift at 102, and this was like kind of questionable, right? Because people were like, oh, maybe you should go Jonathan Taylor, blah, blah, blah. But he went out, he got his guy, and now DeAndre Swift looks like a stud. He looks pretty good. And I think there's something to be said about having your convictions before the draft, which is the whole purpose of this exercise, and not fraying from those convictions that much. Because you may be losing value, but if, let's say you drafted Najee Harris, he ends up being a bust where you could have had a Javonte because that was your guy, you would feel much worse about yourself than if you went with your guy.
Let me be clear with what I'm saying here. I'm saying that if your board differs from the community, hell yeah, all for it. We love variety. But if your board differs from the community, take that to your advantage. Use that to your advantage. If most of the community has Najee higher than Javonte, that means you're going to get Javonte down the line, which means that you can trade your 106 for the 107 or the 108 and still get him while picking up some other stuff on the way. All of this is just mechanisms in order to make sure that the value, at the end of the day, these are assets, they have values. You're getting them at the right price point.
Cool. So who are you taking at the 108 spot?
So at the 108, we're talking about the guy that you didn't take. I'm taking Najee Harris because that value got pushed down the board. I mean, again, man, Najee, well, many people call him nursing home Najee because he's going to be, 22, 23 when he takes his first snap in the NFL. And that's something to consider when you're thinking about Najee Harris. But let's look at his pros. So Najee Harris exploded his senior season where, he developed an extremely high talent for running and receiving the ball. PFF compares him to Matt Forte, which means that he has extreme bell cow potential. As you talked about, Leo, we don't really buy into that RB0 crap, right? Like, if you won one time because of RB0, congratulations. But that's not something that I think really works. You need to have one of these top 7, 8 running backs in order to be very sure that you're going to produce a championship. And that means that you need volume. And a guy like Najee Harris is going to get you volume running the ball and catching. What I think you should also consider is that, the knocks on Najee are not something to scoff at, but they are things that we can hedge for. So there are two main knocks against Najee. It's his speed and his age. And I think that these are things that are things you should take into consideration, but I think we can hedge for them. When you take a look at Najee's speed, he's not going to hit home runs, he's not going to blow past you, but he is going to run you over, and he is going to be consistent. And I think that's completely fine because when you take a look at the running backs that are in the league, for every Chris Johnson that we have a Derrick Henry. And for every Arian Foster we have a Jamal Lewis, a dude who's just going to make a meme out of you because he's going to run you over. And when I take a look at Najee, I think that his lack of speed is compensated for by his skill in receiving and in terms of just consistent rushing. The other thing that I'd like to consider is his age. And, yes, nursing home Najee is going to be a little bit older than Javonte or other running backs in this class, but I'd like to consider the fact that he really only played for 2.5 years, where, the first year he didn't really have that much production, he didn't really play that much, and when you age adjust his performance, 2.5 years of college production puts him right in that category with all these other guys who go at the top of their class. So ultimately speaking, at 108, I think Najee, adjusting for all of these things, I'm pretty happy with this value. If I was drafting this guy in the top 4, right, like where Jonathan Taylor, DeAndre Swift, Clyde Edwards-Helaire was going last year, I'd be really, really concerned because of all of these considerations. But as we move further back into the first round, we are increasing our tolerance for risk. And Najee at 108 is, I'm very happy with the risk at this pick.
Yeah, I think that's just something that's also super unique with this year's draft, where we have 5 quarterbacks probably going in the top 7 picks. You are afforded luxuries like this where Najee Harris is falling to you at 108. I think if you were to get him here in an actual draft, you wouldn't be sad about your pick. You'd sprint to go put your pick in.
All right, Leo, where are we going at 109?
Yeah, 109. So earlier we talked about Ja'Marr Chase. I'm going to go with my wide receiver 2 of this draft, Rashod Bateman.
My man, Shoddy B.
My man, Rashod Bateman. So if there's anyone in this draft that can surpass Ja'Marr Chase in the future, I think it's probably Rashod Bateman. He's got all the tangibles that you probably want in a alpha wide receiver, and he has the production to back it up. So in 2018, when Rashod Bateman was a freshman, he ate up 27.2% of the target share, and then in 2019, he went up to 28.8%, and then in 2020, he jumped up to 30.4%. So this guy was consistently increasing his target share, and he started off with an insane amount of targets. Like, he's basically their Minnesota offense. So we're basically seeing a guy that took the alpha role on the Minnesota offense and then went on and put up 2 more consecutive years of insane production. And we know that college production is one of the biggest indicators of success, because if you can't produce in college against similar guys, what's to say you can produce in the NFL against stronger, faster, bigger guys? And so Rashod Bateman was doing that consistently. Another thing I would like to mention is after the catch, Rashod Bateman was a monster with picking up the extra yardage. So on 147 career catches, he racked up 36 broken tackles, which translates to roughly 1 broken tackle to every 4 catches. And he has great size too. So this guy is 6'2", 210 pounds. If you imagine this 6'2", 210 pounds can go up, grab the ball, and then he can break the tackle afterwards, I think that you'd be really happy with your pick here. If there's anyone in this draft class that could be surpass Ja'Marr Chase, I think it's Rashod Bateman. And we've seen in previous drafts where, there are guys who are maybe more risky picks, like A.J. Brown when he got drafted, or Justin Jefferson when he got drafted, that turned out to be insane wide receiver monsters, like these perennial wide receiver ones that you'd love to have on your team. I think Rashod Bateman could be that guy.
Yeah, man, I have no criticism of this pick. I think that Rashod Bateman has sneaky wide receiver 1 upside in this draft. And, he's one of the guys where I think that his talent speaks enough, but situation here will, he could be the Clyde Edwards-Helaire, I would say, of this draft, where, I don't know, if he ends up in Green Bay, right? Like, Devontae Adams and Rashod Bateman boom, like that's fire. Or even if he ends up in Chicago, you got Allen Robinson on one side and Rashod Bateman on the other. That's electric. I'm super excited to see what he's going to do in the league. I love this pick.
Awesome. So with pick number, what are we on, 10 now? Pick number 10.
Yeah, man. I just got to say, man, I'm livid. I got Travis Etienne on the board at 110. Yeah, man, I'm pissed because this guy should not be here at 110. Travis Etienne, guys, I mean, he's got so many, questions and all that sort of stuff, but I got a guy with running back one upside, strong running back one upside, sitting at the 10th pick. I got to take him, right? Travis Etienne is one of these guys that he's a home run hitting back. If he finds a hole, he's gone, right? Like, if you give him space, he's gone. And that was like completely full on display his junior season, where I think he had like 1,600 total all-purpose yards and 19 touchdowns. His senior season, his receiving game actually became a lot more polished. If we go back to the Notre Dame game, I remember this one particular catch where I saw it and I was like, what the hell? Like, how did he catch that? And it was pretty indicative of his skill. He became the number one receiving running back in all of college football last season. One of his major components is his elusiveness. And Travis Etienne had the 12th most missed tackles in college last season, with an incredible 1.8 total yards before contact, which means that Travis Etienne was making guys miss. He did not have a lot of space before he, met a defender, and in order to get his yards, he had to create space. But I think something that we need to consider is that Etienne is one of the guys where situation will matter, because Travis Etienne is not a grinded out back. Travis Etienne is one of these guys who has limited vision, right? He's going to be caught cheating a lot, and he's going to hit the first thing that he sees. When you take a look at Clemson's offensive line in 2020, it regressed because 4 starters went to the NFL, and as a result, his efficiency and overall numbers dipped from the running perspective. He is going to be completely reliant on where he ends up in the NFL because his offensive line has to give him opportunities in order for him to succeed. If he has those opportunities, he's going to be an extremely high upside pick. Ultimately, at 110, I think that this is exceptional value. Again, considering all of his knocks, if I could grab him at 110, I would be super happy. Normally in this slot, we're looking at like wide receiver 4 or 5 in a normal draft who has, major question marks. I mean, I think last year we had guys like, Denzel Mims and Jalen Reagor, where if we were to average out what the film community and the analytics community would say, those guys would be like borderline wide receiver 1, wide receiver 2s. Here I'm getting like a very clear-cut running back 1 at the 10th pick. So I'm super happy.
Yeah, I think if you're selecting Etienne at 10 here, that's exceptional value. You're not going to be really sad with your pick. And then the whole talk about him as a senior running back doesn't really concern me. He was putting up numbers far before that. He was supposed to come out last year, but he decided to stay another year. And I think he was pretty hindered by that new Clemson offensive line. One of the things that concerns me, and this is why I had Javonte and Najee ranked higher, is his lack of vision. And you saw his decrease in production from last year to this year after his offensive line left. I think in the NFL, when their situations are faster, when the line, I think in the NFL, when the situations are faster and the line is more situational, Etienne could be a guy that has more question marks. And I heard someone on Twitter refer to him as fancy Tevin Coleman. And
oh, no.
I kind of like that comparison, even though it's, like, whatever. If he's fancy Tevin Coleman, I don't want to touch him.
But hey, I think you're willing to take that risk at the 10th pick here.
Definitely.
Especially, as we talked about, that's an extremely low floor. But this is one of the guys that I would watch for post draft to see how he fluctuates. If he ends up on a team like, I don't know, if he ends up on Arizona, I'd be a little nervous because their offensive line is kind of eh. But if he ends up getting drafted by, I don't know, Pittsburgh, I'd be pretty excited to see what happens. All right, Leo. So with the 11th pick, your final pick in this mock draft, you have a lot of good options here. Where are you going?
Okay, so I've been looking at this guy more and more, and I just absolutely love what he does on the field. And if you haven't guessed, it's Rondale Moore. I mean, he's short, but he's not really small. The guy is 5'9", but he's 180 pounds, and he's got the speed and strength to go along with it. He was clocked in at a 4.33 40. I think this was in high school, and then at 180 pounds, he's squatting 600. That's absolutely insane.
Is that illegal?
That's illegal. That's illegal. He's not allowed to do that. And I know 40 times aren't a good indicator of fantasy success, but we need to look holistically at the player and see what that 40 time can tell us about his role in the NFL. So in 2018, when he was healthy, he led the FBS with 37 tackles and averaged 11 yards per reception. So essentially what you're looking at here is a guy who can get those tough yards after the catch because he's got the strength to do so. Like, he's squatting 600 pounds. And then he's got the speed to turn on the burners afterwards. So in college, he played a lot of that like slot role to throw the screens to the guy and let him just take off afterwards. And I think he could probably fill that whole Tyreek Hill wide receiver role in the NFL. And his college production profile is kind of meh after his freshman year, but that was because he's been kind of out with injuries. He had a hamstring injury in 2019, and then I think in 2020 is kind of like undisclosed. And that gives me some pause. That's like the major concern for me to why I have Ja'Marr Chase and Rashod Bateman ranked over him. And I know it's kind of corny, but in my opinion, the best ability is still availability, right? If you're going in on a Sunday and you don't have your best wide receiver giving you points against your rival, he's not really doing much for you. So Ja'Marr Chase and Rashod Bateman just have comparable profiles with the college production to back it without the major injury history. And so that's why Rondale Moore is 3 here for me. I'm not really concerned about his filling a role as a slot receiver. I know people dock him for, he was a slot guy in college, so that's what he'll be in the NFL. But that who cares? If you're a GM drafting in the NFL, okay, maybe you care. If you're drafting in fantasy football, if a guy who gets you yards is a guy who gets you yards, who cares? If he can even come close to becoming like a Steve Smith type of player, which he's often comped to, I think you would be extremely happy with drafting him at 11.
Yeah, he gives me these like really mean, tough slot dude who like he's not afraid to go over the middle and in fact will hit you like a damn safety. I think the two apt comparisons for him in my mind are Golden Tate and Steve Smith, two guys who were a little bit undersized. But they are just dense, and they dole out punishment, and they can, they're smooth. They can get across the field. They are, shifty, but they also have speed. And when you mix in agility, speed, and size, like Rondale Moore is a really, really interesting prospect. Here's my question for you, Leo. You now have, based on our board, we had Ja'Marr Chase, we had Rashod Bateman, and now you have Rondale Moore. There are 3 guys that a lot of people in the community who you just skipped right over. Like they would be like, what are you doing? These are guys like Devonta Smith, Jalen Waddle, and Kadarius Toney. You don't have to like all those guys, but you're telling me all 3 of those guys are lower than Rondale in your mind?
Look, it wouldn't be a wide receiver video if we didn't talk about Devonta Smith. But in my mind, yes, because when you look at guys like Rondale Moore, Rashod Bateman, these are guys that are producing as freshmen, which means that they're going up against bigger, tougher guys as freshmen, and they're succeeding. They are their team's offense. And we look at guys like Devontae Smith, Jalen Waddle, Kadarius Toney. They just didn't have these profiles. And if I were to project them into the NFL, we've historically seen that college production earlier is a greater sign of success than it is later. That's when people talk about like all the breakout age related things. And I know the number one argument that people will come back and say is like, oh, but the NFL drafted Devontae Smith at 10, like the NFL knows what they're doing. I think I disagree fundamentally with that. I think if you work at a workplace, any workplace, you'll know that people in your workplace, they don't know what the hell they're doing. Like, that's no different in the NFL, even though that these people like do this every single day, right? Like, we see GM turnover, we see coaching turnover, we see Henry Ruggs drafted as the first wide receiver, right? And look how that turned out. So the NFL itself it's not infallible, right? Like, we need to make our own decisions, and the easiest way for us, since we're not huge film guys, is using the data that we have, and the data that we have tells me that Rondale Moore is the guy I want.
Yeah, I'd say that in the NFL, we have the two kinds of analytics groups that we outlined at the beginning of the video. We have the people who are like, hey, I've done this, I have domain knowledge, just trust me, but I'm not going to tell you what my reasoning is. And you have the people who are, hey, there's new information, let me adjust to it. And I think that's what you have to understand the NFL is. There are many teams who know what they're doing and make calculated decisions. But for every John Harbaugh and Bill Belichick there's a Ryan Pace and a John Gruden. And we need to be honest about that. Not every team knows what they're doing. And just because other people are paid to do a job doesn't necessarily mean that they can do it better.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And it's, I think, one that is often lost in the dynasty community. So we've gotten to our last pick. It's been a long journey here. Who are you picking at 112?
Man, I feel like you leave me such insane value on every pick. Because you know who I'm picking right here? I'm picking Kyle Armpits. This guy, Kyle Pitts, is, as many people in the community would say, if he was a wide receiver, he'd be the wide receiver 2 in this draft. He'd be going in front of Rondale Moore. He'd be going in front of Jalen Waddle, Devonta Smith, ... Kyle Pitts has the potential to be an absolute monster. But I will say that this seems like a pretty appropriate place to take him. And I'll tell you why. So when we take a look at Kyle Pitts, he is... Let's consider all of his wide receiver traits. He has a massive catch radius, he plays like a wide receiver, and in tight end premium, that means that he's going to be getting a lot of receptions, which means that you're going to be getting a lot of points, and you're going to be getting a lot of targets, and he's going to be one of these OP tight ends, right? A Konami code for tight ends. So Kyle Pitts had 4.91 yards per route, which means that he was running down the field. It was the third highest yards per route of all wide receivers and tight ends in the nation, which means that this guy, like, he's doing stuff, he's running routes, and his receiving grade was the highest on deep balls, passes 20 yards or more down the field. But here's the thing, right? When we're talking about tight ends, we have to understand what their transition to the NFL looks like. And although Kyle Pitts might be OP, when you take a look at Kittle, Kelsey, or Waller, all of these guys did not produce immediately. All of these guys took time to transition to the NFL. And if you combine this with the fact that beyond those top 3, there's a massive drop-off at the position, I have to consider that this guy isn't going to produce at that elite tight end level, or isn't likely to, right out of the gate. Unless Kyle Pitts ends up being one of the top 4 tight ends instantaneously, and he might be, he's not worth it anywhere in the top 6 of this draft. I would rather take my chances with any of the other players that we drafted. But let's consider what Kyle Pitts is in terms of his receiving ability. So we're going to put up these 2 profiles on the screen, and we're going to ask you to tell us which one you prefer more. So on one side, we have, this guy who has a really high average depth of target, has a lot of deep catches, has a lot of deep yards, and doesn't really drop the ball. And the other guy is also producing, but he is clearly not in the same tier as the first guy. So obviously you can tell that this is a gotcha question. If we were to reveal who that wide receiver is, who's that wide receiver? We're looking at Rashod Bateman versus Kyle Pitts. We would unequivocally say that Rashod Bateman is one of the top wide receivers in this draft. But Kyle Pitts' numbers as a tight end with Kadarius Toney on his team blows Rashod Bateman's numbers out of the water. And that means that a guy like Kyle Pitts, if his transition to the NFL is one very similar to a wide receiver, if he's utilized like a wide receiver, if he's treated in that massive volume, run a lot of routes, get into open space type of tight end, Kyle Pitts has the potential to be an absolute monster. He would unequivocally be in that wide receiver 2 discussion by himself. And it's for that reason that here at 112, again, when we're talking about risk, when we're talking about upside, Kyle Pitts at 112, I'm in love. Like, what's there to complain about?
Definitely, yeah. I don't think I can really fault you here. Kyle Pitts is probably he's probably the best wide receiver in this draft. You could make that argument, and I wouldn't disagree with you. I think this is incredible value. I know that Drew had a thread about how you shouldn't draft tight ends in the first round because of their ADP drop. Do you think Kyle Pitts is an exception here?
I think that is a personal tolerance question. If you feel all aboard the Pitts hype train, I think that at this, we're effectively in the second round at this point, right? When you're in these last, 110, 111, 112 picks, you're now getting into that range of players who could be this, could be that. There's a lot more question marks. And I'd say that of the guys that are left on the board, we're talking about, again, one more time, Devonta Smith, Jalen Waddle, Kyle Pitts, Kyle Trask, Kadarius Toney, Kenneth Gainwell, Brevin Jordan, Pat Freiermuth. What name sticks out there? For me, it's Kyle Pitts. So I think that here at the 112, it's fine. I think that it's worth taking a chance on him here. You're not going to get him later on in the second round.
Just to recap, we went Trevor Lawrence at 1, Justin Fields at 2, Zach Wilson at 3, Trey Lance at 4, Mac Jones at 5, Jamar Chase at 6, Javonte Williams at 7, Najee Harris at 8, Rashod Bateman at 9, Travis Etienne at 10, Rondale Moore at 11, and Kyle Pitts at 12.
So net, what we can see here from our mock draft is we clearly differ a little bit from the rest of what you've probably seen. And that's not because we're trying to give you different content. We're trying to give you what we think as fantasy players and how our analysis goes when we're evaluating these, the talent of these players. Given the positional value, I don't think it's ridiculous to say that the top 5 picks of this draft could very well be, of your rookie draft, could be quarterbacks. And as a result, that means that you're going to have insane value later down the line.
Yeah, so we'll be posting our rankings in the comment section below. Make sure that you comment and subscribe and let us know what we got right and what we got wrong. If you want to tweet at us, we're always on Twitter. We're replying to every single person. Go ahead. We're going to put that in the description as well. But that wraps it up for today's episode of The Breakout. Abhi, you want to hit the music?
Let's hit that music.